Welcome to the show. My guest is a market designer and game theorist working on better economic systems. After training in nuclear engineering, he worked for tech startups at the peak of the dot-com boom. Becoming fascinated by the mathematics of information and computation led to patent work on a better commodity market design. From Charlesville, Virginia, please welcome Noah Healy.
Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, no problem. And looking forward to this. I suppose, I mean, prior to recording, I said I want to kind of discuss, because you've the white paper, we go through that in the order that it is. But I suppose let's kind of, because I know you're big into maths and everything, let's kind of let the listeners know about a little bit more about your kind of your journey to know, like not without what you've created, but kind of how you got into the maths in your own kind of career.
Sure. Well, I've always had a computational facility. I was the fastest counter, and then the fastest adder, and then the fastest multiplier, and that kind of thing. And that led to getting through sort of school maths a lot quicker than most of the other students that I was around. And so I started going to university in my junior year of high school, which is like 16, basically. And then I went to college in an engineering school and studied a very wide variety of mathematics. Most of the core mathematics required for engineering I had already taken while I was in high school. And so I was able to just sort of take a smorgasbord of subjects. But my real turning point was after getting out of school, I got a job working at a sort of dot-com startup. And there I had to really use a programming language. And because of the way my brain works and sort of the ethical instructions from my college, I decided to really get in deep and understand the fundamentals of how the various pieces of it worked. And the programming language in question, called Perl, actually has some very deep connections to the fundamental concepts of computer science. And so pretty quickly I was reading the papers that guys like Alan Turing and Stephen Kleene had written about what computers even were. And for the last quarter of a century, I've been reading and trying to understand and getting up and then applying and then going back and trying to understand these ideas. They're some of the deepest and most beautiful ideas that people have ever had, and so it's a very rewarding journey.
Mhm. Just because basically, as I suppose with the listeners, because like prior to recording, after doing the research, I said this is suitable for a few of the podcasts, including the crypto and the awakening, perhaps the speaking as well. And like, just you might just let people know as well your blockchain journey, understanding it, hearing about it, and your own experiences with that.
Yeah, sure. Well, so I saw blockchain as it first came out. There were some other interesting technologies as well. There were people that were doing digital gold technologies. The idea was that there would be actual gold vaults, and they would use sort of standard computer accounting techniques to allow that gold to be digitized. And so that was kind of in the mix with that. I thought the paper was very interesting, and followed the development of the various blockchain technologies from a cryptographic and mathematical interest point of view. Uh, I My discovery of my market system caused a wide scale reassessment of my beliefs about markets and economics and money. And with that point of view, I've come to be somewhat more skeptical of blockchain as a reparent in our system, because what they are ultimately doing, if they're functional, and of course many of the chains are very obvious scams, but Things like Bitcoin and to a lesser extent Ethereum are sincere projects or sincere-ish projects or have become sincere projects. Uh, but they're attempting to establish a currency, and a currency doesn't have the capacity to self-value. It's only valuable within the context of the economy that it is driving. And that economy actually requires markets to distill and purvey those value information. And our markets don't function in the presence of information networks that are more powerful than the marketplace, like the internet is, which means that the blockchain technologies are creating a digital currency on a technology that invalidates the markets that they use to validate their value proposition. And so without repairing that part of the system, I think that it's unfortunately mostly wasted effort right now. Although it could it could play a role as part of a system that does work. I think that. Are you familiar with the stone coins of Yap?
No.
It's an interesting thing. It's a group of tribes in the South Pacific that, prior to colonization and conquest, had developed a currency based on quarrying and carving these large stone wheels as coins, and then assigning social value and ownership through gossip across the tribal groups. And so the coins themselves could be simply set in a yard and not moved because the ownership of the coin was being held in trust by the tribal awareness and understanding of who truly owned the coins. Um, they are, in my view, precisely analogous to blockchain, and demonstrate that, in fact, within a social context, those kinds of systems could work. Unfortunately, I think our present social context isn't a social context capable of working. But if we develop a social context capable of working, then much like the coins themselves, I think, with some caveats, there's a future there.
Like prior to Bitcoin, the NSA had created something, the white paper kind of similar. I've asked a lot of people on the crypto and I'm getting so many different answers. I'd love to know you. One, do you think it's created by good people or bad people? Because it was during the crisis. But one thing to be aware of, and I'm not sure if you know, but they released white paper on Halloween, which kind of is connected with kind of pagan beliefs and a lot of demonic stuff, which to me made me kind of go, ooh, this is interesting. So I'd love to know your thoughts on who you think created it.
I don't really have a lot of thoughts on who created it. I do have some technical criticisms. The blockchains that they've gotten away from this on a theoretical perspective of single cryptography dependency. Um, but as a practical matter, the chains that are in general use have a massive point of failure around the collapse of the cryptographic system they're using for chain production, hashing, whatnot. And they do not have a kind of simple multi-protocol mechanism that exists. And frankly, if they did have such a thing, it would greatly increase the cost of the operation of the chain. And that's another issue that needs to be, I think, addressed. Uh, I I'd mentioned to you before that I actually developed a kind of lightweight blockchain protocol for a friend. It wasn't nearly as impressive as Bitcoin, and it wouldn't be a sort of useful replacement of currency. It was simply to create a time priority ordering digitally. But it used a gossip protocol system and uh, and could be operated on multiple simultaneous types of cryptographic protocols, so that in the event that we discover a flaw in one of our existing cryptographic protocols, the resulting outputs would be effectively untouched. You'd have to simultaneously cause all functioning protocols to fail to make this particular idea stop working. Um, and again, that's kind of as good as you can get in these contexts. Is um, you know, up to the 51% attack, or up to how many people are engaged and how much it would cost to buy enough computer hardware to outvote them, or all these other things. Uh, Consensus protocols are conditioned on that consensus, and it is difficult to solve that problem in the digital realm, particularly now that we're seeing fake people as a real business. uh the a consensus of you and a billion AI bots is not necessarily anything that you're going to be interested in being around. And that's increasingly the kinds of systems that we're engaged with. Our markets themselves are mostly AI bots, and have been for several decades.
The, the commodities, then it's Coordisc is the company that you, is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, yeah. It's the beginning of coordination and then the beginning of discovery. So Coordisc, however you pronounce the first couple syllables of coordination, is how you should pronounce that word.
So, like as I mentioned at the start, I think what we do is we'll go through like the white paper, and just you can kind of give a brief synopsis of each of the sections, and then obviously I can give a link so people can actually download the white paper, and they'll find it on your website anyway. But like section one, price discovery, the function of the market. So you might just kind of touch because basically that's explaining what you're coming about, why it's doing. So you might explain to the listeners why all this came about.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Well, this came about because I was thinking about network protocols and how we can achieve consensus on networks, and how we can use these artificial agents. AI wasn't really a major thing, although OpenAI had made some impressive strides when I started doing this work. Internet of Things has also produced some interesting ideas, and a few gewgaws. We see the great proliferation of drone technologies, and so on. And so sensor nets, and other sorts of ideas are becoming current, or have been for a while. And I was very curious about the underlying mathematics of how we could get these things to work in ways that we wanted them to work, and not just kind of spend a bunch of money, do a bunch of stuff, and then try to see if anything good happened on the back end. And so that was sort of the fundamental motivator. When I came up with my idea, I applied them to marketplaces, because marketplaces are a super intelligent technology that is about wrangling information. And the core value of the marketplace is this price information. The core value to the customer is that you can get a counterparty, that you can show up at the market, and when you want to buy stuff, the stuff is there and you can buy it. And you can show up at the market, and when you want to sell stuff, you can sell stuff, and the stuff is there. And that is, of course, what the customer actually cares about. But the thing that makes that possible is that the price level is at a place where the number of people that show up with stuff, and the number of people that show up with money wanting stuff, or the amount of stuff that people want and the amount of stuff that people want to provide, is very similar to each other. In most cases, the same. And so unless you figure out what that number is, and more importantly, how those numbers are evolving through time, you will not reach this point of view. And you'll, you know, I I'm a child of the 70s and 80s. I remember the news stories. You said you're out of Poland, of people standing in long lines for things. That's a shortage problem, you know. Uh, that's a result of getting that number wrong. Um, and that's what happens. You get that number wrong, and you either have undersupply and people have to sort of beg, borrow, steal, or oversupply, and the people that are doing the supplying frequently go bankrupt under those circumstances because they got grain coming out of their ears and nobody can eat it. So that's the difficulty. That's the problem that markets solve for us, is creating a forum that most of the time gets those numbers correctly, so that we can have economies where you don't have to know the entire supply chain of every bite of food you put in your mouth, and every ore trace that belongs in every machine that you use, and so
How do we solve the situation with the corruption that's going on? And it's an international thing. So, for example, the eggs in America. I mean, there was a load of egg factories that actually just burnt down. I mean, that's orchestrated. That's not something that, oh, one burned down, we understand, but there was a load. Even in the land, like, there's loads of countries, they're telling the farmers, they're paying the farmers not to grow the crops, just let it go wild or whatever. And one, does that decrease the minerals and stuff like that? If they do crop rotation and everything. But they're intentionally manipulating markets by doing that. And like, I presume, like farmers, because of the regulations and like those that control the government, like most of them are afraid of them, and they're afraid of losing their license, or how they'll attack them in other ways. They'll say, oh, you owe us tax, and they mightn't, but they'll just whatever way they want. So they tend to kind of comply, which in turn manipulates markets. So if you're kind of betting on commodities and just kind of in a normal market, but sometimes it can change without you even knowing what's going on. I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
well, going back to the example, from Poland and sort of behind the Iron Curtain and their vast, market dislocations that were a result of basically bureaucracies making decisions that they didn't have the capacity to make, and then sort of doubling down on them. Well, that was a case of perverse incentives. The bureaucrats couldn't do their jobs, but if they said, "Hey, I can't do my job," then they would be fired and replaced by somebody who was unwilling to say, "Hey, I can't do my job." So the system didn't work, not because the people in it were incompetent or corrupt, although they were, but because it couldn't work. And then this unworkable system attracted more and more incompetent and corrupt people, because they would have an easier time with that. I would say that existing market structure, which has a much better pedigree, markets have been around since the Renaissance. They've worked pretty well for most of that time. Had the same thing happen to it around half or a third a century ago, with the rise of computerization and the internet, and that it too is now a corrupt system that cannot work and is attracting more and more corrupt people. And so, unfortunately, for the sort of operators and middlemen of the marketplace, they make more money the wider the spread between the farmer and the consumer is. And so, the more uncertainty and the more craziness that they can inject into the system, the better off they are in a bank accounts. And so driving farms into, non-functioning by just telling them to stop working, or turning off the supply of key nutrients that allows them to function, or turning off their energy supply, all of which there have been large scale farm protests around in Europe and England. To All those things have happened. Um, those things are all broadly and in many cases specifically beneficial to the people operating marketplaces or speculating in marketplaces, if they can know about them at least a few milliseconds before the general public knows about them. And so that I think is attracting a worse and worse class of people to it. But that's not the core issue. The core issue is that the system itself is broken. And so uh, I'd say it's more a case of broken systems attracting corrupt people than corrupt people having broken our systems. But I'd be willing to be argued off that position.
I was reading the book Corruptible, and it was kind of wondering how people kind of do these things. And a lot of the times, it's corruptible people are attracted to the positions that they can actually manipulate. It's because sometimes things they get into a position and they're bribed and then they're compromised, and that's why they do it. But it looks like even police officers and stuff like that, a lot of times they're the ones more abusive in relationships, and they tend to go into positions where they can use their power. And, because
Well, yeah. One of the points that I make, and I think it's a very serious one that affects us across a lot more than just economics, is that I see in the world sort of nihilistic thinking becoming socially and culturally and politically and economically dominant. And I don't think that's because, uh, everybody became nihilist. I think it's because we discovered that we were fundamentally wrong about things about a century ago. And, um, you know, our technology, from our phones to, GPS to the internet to large amounts of the energy that comes out of our walls, is based on us being right about being wrong about most of the things that led to having the societies that we have. And so the nihilists are technically correct. If you go out and say, "Oh, this is broken," well, you're right, it is. And so you can attract people to this cause of, "Hey, that's broken," very easily. Unfortunately, the sort of people that just want to tear everything down aren't really the people that can build anything back up. And so you get this kind of cycle of degradation.
very good. Like the basic economic assumptions then was because we touched on the second one, we touched on the current system. So the section three on it is the basic economic assumptions.
Yeah, well, so economics comes from the same root word as ecology, which is, kind of the study of reality, right? Like everything. So economics is an unbelievably broad topic. Uh, but in general, um, it tries to restrict itself to non-coercive, and I would be very uncomfortable creating a system that was evil. So the assumptions that I lay out are that uh, people should participate in the system because they are, and they also perceive themselves to be benefiting by participating in the system. And that within that context, um, what the proper function of a marketplace is would be maximizing the value of the transfer of goods or services through itself, uh, with the restriction that everybody can go anywhere else they want to as soon as they find a better deal.
Next section I'll use mathematical foundations.
Well, yeah, that could have been a lot longer. I mean, that could have been a textbook or multiple textbooks, because I'm kind of pulling together some disparate ideas. But in order to understand what it is I'm talking about, you need some basic calculus. Uh, there's also a little bit of topology. There's a notion called a metric space. So a space is a very general idea in mathematics. Um, and it encompasses the kinds of spaces that you might have learned about in geometry, or you might find yourself familiar with in your day-to-day life, thinking in terms of, navigating your living room or your town. Um, a metric space has slightly more structure. A metric space is a space that also has a function that just tells you how far apart the points in it are. Uh, and and when most people hear that, their first thought is, you mean there are spaces where you can't do that? And the answer is, in fact, yes. In some sense, most spaces aren't metrizable, but lots of the interesting ones are, and so that's what's going on there. And then finally, game theory. Uh, Game theory is the mathematics of strategy, and it allows us to quantify and uh, describe the interactions of agents that are capable of making decisions. And so there's game theory if you're training your dogs. There's game theory for, global scale marketplaces. There's game theory if you're uh, engaging in something like AC Doocy or rock, paper, scissors with your friends at the bar.
One of the main ones that I like in the Awakening podcast is the solution. This section.
Right. Well, so uh, basically, the marketplace as it stands is fundamentally about buyers and sellers coming together. But because of how it functions, there are these informal roles where people who are not really making, say, wheat, uh, are still selling it, and those people then turn around, and while they're not really like milling wheat or baking bread, they buy it, and so they just exist as middlemen. And the two primary roles within the marketplace that have to do this are the operators of the marketplace themselves, who are sort of the buyers and sellers of last resort, and then speculators. And speculators are divided into kind of two groups. There's informed speculators, and those are the ones that are making money, and maybe not all of them. And then uninformed speculators, and those are the ones that are losing money. And that's it. Well, informed speculators are valuable for achieving those numbers we were talking about that are the entire value proposition in the marketplace. And the operator is valuable for sort of having the forum where those numbers can be found. And so I sort of worked out the game theory of how to shake them loose from having to interfere with the buying selling part of the marketplace, and created this new machine that instead of having kind of, you know, two ports, a buyer port and a seller port, has four ports. There's an operator port that keeps the machine on. There's a speculation piece or a forecasting piece where people can provide direct information about where price is going in their opinion, and that gets aggregated with other opinions and then tested against the final piece where buyers and sellers come in, take a look at the price that's on offer, and decide, just as they do now, how much of it that they like. And so the system produces the same important outcomes, but does so in this very different kind of way.
What I've heard with oil and gas is markets, they're so controlled that it's very hard for people to get in. And there's so many different middlemen as well. And I mean, if we look just at the petrol pump, a war here, and that's the reason they've gone up. On the opposite side of the pond, another war, and that's the same reason that it's gone up. Yet there's so many different areas where it's supplied. Like, can that ever change?
Well, again, as it presently happens, the marketplace wants chaos to exist. So those other two roles currently make a lot more money the less predictable and the crazier things can get. So an example, so it's not petrol, but I've tried this out a lot. Um, when the Ukrainian invasion happened, when Russia invaded Ukraine, Russia is like the third largest wheat producer on earth. Ukraine was like the fifth, I think, largest wheat producer on earth at that point. Um, the wheat market went completely insane, obviously. Uh, as a result of that, the number one and number two wheat producers on earth, which is Canada and the United States, planted 0 new acres of wheat. And the reason they did that is because the complete insanity of the marketplace did not filter out to the actual farmers that actually plant crops and would have gotten a windfall profit that would have encouraged them to plant more wheat so there'd be more food and that we'd all have a normal system. It got entirely chewed up by this speculator group that managed to intercept all that money before it got to the farmers. And so the farmers are essentially looking at the same prices that they were always looking at. We, as the consumers, get to see the crazy end of things, and middlemen who exacerbated and lengthened the amount of time it took for the world economy to sort of recover and normalize benefited from causing that to happen. And that's, again, not sort of evil, corrupt manipulators. That's actually how that system works if the speculators have the ability to intercept the windfalls, which, thanks to computers, they do. And so, in that context, I'm not saying that, wheat speculators whispered in Putin's ear and caused him to invade Ukraine, but it is in the general interest of everybody engaged in speculating in these markets for chaos to happen. Because when chaos does happen, then a windfall is produced. And if their machines can intercept that windfall, then their bank accounts will grow. And so, you know, the worse things get on the nightly news, the richer they get. And in fact, if you look at the last 50 years, that's precisely what we see.
Section and its qualitative arguments.
Yeah. Well, so um I can't remember off the top of my head exactly which arguments I put out there, but in general, this gets into walking through the interests of the various people to make it clear. We just actually covered one of them right there with that example of right now. It is in the interest of speculators to create a sort of social or political conditions that would make the economic hardship for their user base. Um, in an environment where speculators are making money as a direct function of how profitable it is to be a producer in the marketplace, like in my marketplace, then those same kinds of connected people would be interested in political or social evolutions that cause farming to become more profitable. Because the more profitable farming is, the bigger the bank accounts get. So you get that alignment of interest versus non-alignment of interest. And I basically walk through for each case. So the speculator, producer pairing, speculator consumer pairing, the forecast, the operator speculator pairing. With 4 things, there's 6 pairings to walk through. And in each case, uh, using this market mechanism provides a positive, sort of co-interest in market activity. And then in all the triples, and there's 4 of them, there's a positive co-interest in market activity. And then finally, the entire group together has a positive co-interest in positive market activity. And so I sort of walk through what all those arguments are. It is conversationally, you could pick one. We've already gone through, one of the biggies, but and I could do it again, but it's probably easier to read the paper to get the full details of all of them.
With, like, say, the speculator. So if we look at what's going on in California, and I mean, I've been there years ago, and I know that they do a lot of avocados, but also they're big on the wine. I'm not sure because I know that there's so much acres that have been destroyed. How does that work? Do they class as that as an act of God? Because usually the insurance companies never want to pay out. But how does it work for the speculator when they're expecting to get something to sell on? How does it work when something is destroyed?
Well, when that happens, speculators can be in a certain amount of trouble. When COVID occurred, and so it wasn't supply being destroyed, but demand being destroyed. So America goes into lockdown. We stop driving to work. An enormous amount of the gas, petrol, that we use is so that people can drive to work. And suddenly we're not using that anymore. And the price of oil, the price of crude oil went negative. Um, and there are some people that lost their shirts on that. However, if you can sort of use your computer programs to get out before everyone else does, it's not you that's losing your shirt. And so what we will see in California is that people who were holding the bag, who were able to let go of the bag slightly faster than everybody else that was holding the bag, will not bear the brunt of the bag holding that they were doing, and everyone else will sort of get their arms pulled out of their sockets because they were expecting there to be like 50 hands on this bag, and it'll turn out to be just you. Um, and and that's actually what's being talked about in, I think, very lightly coded language. I saw an interview with Gavin Newsom. He's the governor of California recently. He went on a podcast to talk about what he was working on, and he said primarily what he was the primary thing he talked about working on is speculation in land use. So they're going to sort of get out in front of deciding how to manipulate the the value of that land. Um, and California has a long history of that. Most of the very, very rich in California are land barons. Um, and so I guess, we'll see. Uh, but in general, the speculators in the current world make money by either stepping out of the way as the axe falls, or having their hand on the handle as the axe falls, depending on which side is paying.
Regulation then. Like, I mean, we heard about regulation in the blockchain world, crypto world, and all. Like, people don't want it when they want to hide their assets and everything. But when something once goes wrong, that's when they want regulation. They want to be protected. But with the commodity, what way is the current regulations?
Uh, Commodity markets are very heavily regulated, uh, and regulation of the commodity markets is something that's been an ongoing, evolving process again for centuries. So the regulations are, in general, pretty well actually applied in the United States and in the City of London, which are the two most important locations for commodity markets on planet Earth. And they're pretty clear as well. Unfortunately, as I said, the problem isn't sort of the people in the system; it's the system itself. And so the regulations are incredibly tightly bound to the structure of the existing commodity markets. Um, so what is allowed and disallowed is essentially only true in context, and the things that you might actually care about, and the things that people do actually care about. So people would be very disturbed by, say, speculators manipulating market for private profit to the general detriment of the entire economy. Uh, but the existing markets can't distinguish between a speculator that's making money because they're helping and a speculator that's making money because they hurt. And so the regulations do not make that distinction because the markets themselves cannot make that distinction. Uh, and so the regulations are sort of very much about compliance with the exact operation of the marketplace, and then trusting that the market operations themselves will function. Um, I don't know what like speed limits are like. I know that, the Autobahn doesn't have speed limits. I know other parts of Europe do have speed limits, but imagine if speed limits weren't attached to how fast your car could actually move down the road, but were attached to how fast the wheels of your car could spin. And then you developed some sort of hovercraft that didn't have wheels. And then, you know, though you don't have wheels, those rules don't mean anything in your context. And so that's kind of very much the way the regulations currently function. They are hyper specified to the exact procedures of existing markets, with the assumption that those markets are perfect. And sadly, those markets aren't perfect.
So regarding the patent, because prior to we had a conversation prior to it, and I've had some experience with patents just working with a few people. But first, you might just say what your patent is, because I know it's kind of in the white paper, but exactly what you, and then your experience with the patent office.
Sure. Well, so I'm patenting machines that can be used to allow you to operate these kinds of marketplaces. Um, so it can be thought of as a process patent or a software patent, or there's a bunch of different sort of terms that have been used, and it's constantly evolving. But the core of my discovery is this sort of set of relationships of information processing, and that that set of things encapsulated within a thing is what I'm patenting, and all that is very vague. But that's unfortunately because of how vague patent laws itself is. Um, in terms of my experience with the patent office, the process has been slow, which is not unusual. It has also been, on their part, criminal and fraudulent, which it appears is unusual, although maybe not as much as we might like. So 4 years ago, I received a notice of acceptance. That's sort of an up check from your patent examiner. And at that point, they're supposed to give you the patent if you pay the fee, unless they discover that they made a really, really egregious mistake. And then they have to write you a letter about the egregious mistake and say, sorry, we're not going to do this because we screwed up. We should never said yes in the first place. They decided to do neither of those things. They just ignored it. Um, when they were asked about it, they said, we're figuring out why we're not doing this. We'll get back to you. So from the time of the issuance of their acceptance to their actual claim about what their mistake was, there was a 7 month delay. Um, so so obviously they didn't find a mistake and then decide not to give me the patent. They decided not to give me the patent and then desperately looked for a mistake that they could hang that decision on. The mistake that they hung the decision on was actually not a mistake and was something that could be mathematically disproved. So it took a little while to get that proof through my attorneys at the time, but we finally did. They accepted that they were attempting to claim that basically numbers aren't real. Uh, and so they gave me a second notice of acceptance. We applied, paid the fee again. I'd gotten I'm not paying fees over and over again. They refunded the previous one, so I just sort of paid paid in. They withdrew that one. They wrote the letter this time. Uh, and their second bite. So the first bite of the apple was a claim that it was useless, that it didn't improve anything, um, and the mathematical proof demonstrated that it improved something that's very expensive and very important by a factor of at least 10 million. Um, so that's not the same as nothing. Uh, so then they decided to claim that I was actually attempting to monopolize commodity markets in general. This is also very trivially, um, not least because their part of getting a patent is that there has to be novelty, and they've already conceded novelty. And they did so by demonstrating that I'm not talking about existing commodity markets. So I could not use my patent to claim that existing market operators were infringing by doing what they've been doing. So it would be merely competitive in those cases, and that, competition and monopoly are antonyms. So so anyhow, my attorneys spoke to the people they're allowed to speak to. Those people said that, again, this is sort of coming from on high. It all looks like nonsense to them, but there's nothing they can do about it, and that I would have to appeal to patent court, or the Patent Trial and Appeal Board, as it's formally called. So I did that. The Patent Trial and Appeal Board decided that both the first thing that has been mathematically disproved was actually true, that and that the second thing, which again is also nonsensical, was true, and the two of those are also mutually contradictory. That didn't seem to bother them at all. Um, and the only step from them is to go to the federal court system. So I am now in the federal court, in for the Federal Circuit. This is the court that handles disputes between citizens and the federal government of the United States. The only step from here, should there be a step from here on either side, would be the Supreme Court of the United States.
I'm assuming that basically this is a financial drain on you and you're getting nothing back, because that's my experience with courts. Like, it's a time suck and a money suck. And then obviously if you get the proper outcome, you get it back. Or how is it working?
Yeah, so the patent prosecution has been a time suck and a money suck. Fortunately, since I'm basically out of money, I don't have an attorney anymore, so I'm pursuing this part on my own. The court actually has waived its fees, which are minor, but in my circumstance, even minor fees would be pretty rough to cope with. Um, and so it is just a time suck. It is, however, not just a time suck. It's also kind of, it's pretty stressful having your government lie about you in court documents. And that's what I've been going through for uh, several months now. Uh, the the patent office just put in their uh, rebuttal. So I make my case, then they get to rebut. They ask for an extension, so I had sort of an extra month to wait. But on the 8th of January, so just over a week ago, they put in their rebuttal. I have 3 weeks to respond, so clock's ticking. I've got some basic, sort of outline. I got to flesh that out and put it in. Um, I do not have to rebut their rebuttal if I don't want to. So I could skip this. I would prefer to do so because their statements are so false that, in my opinion, they're actually just committing perjury. So so I would like to point that out to the court. Um, but yeah, that's where things are, and it has been a major financial drain. It's also, been, I'm not as well as I might be. I just donated blood a few days ago, and my heart rate and blood pressure are both pretty seriously elevated, from, being, having the weight of the world on my shoulders. And so yeah, that's been very unpleasant. In terms of damages, that is potential. So, you know, hypothetically, according to the Constitution, the federal government of the United States isn't allowed to take things from its citizens without going through certain legal obligations, which they haven't gone through. And so restoration of property, and other things that would be a part of a settlement. Um, but that would be up to the judges. All I can really do is just ask.
Just curious what your thoughts, because with patents, I mean, a lot of the time you can get it. I think it's from the United States and Canada, but then there's Europe. You can go for individual countries. But a lot of people don't go for all of them because it costs so much money and the time, like you can get companies to do it for you, but it costs so much money. And then, unfortunately, some country that's aware of your patent can go away and create something, not about yours, but I'm on about, when people create a different patent, they can create it, then mass market it, send it, and then even if you go after them, they just close that company down, create another. And the whole system is just so badly orchestrated that it's basically hurting the creators. And it's like, unfortunately, I believe in the patent office. I mean, there must be so much corruption as well, where they're passing on information to other countries, because I know of people that they created something and it was created in China very fast, that, or just that they have access to it. So like, it's a shame that there's not one international, you just do a patent and it's done, but it's like, then you have to do yearly payments. And from my memory, I think it just keeps increasing. And is that the way it is? I think it increases every year.
So, so I specifically did not pursue international patents at all, because, for one, the cost, but also because, strategically speaking, I'm not certain whether patenting or not patenting is a better way to get people on board. There's advantages to getting people on board with the patent. There are potentially advantages to getting people on board without the patent. And so this system is explicitly oversource outside the United States and its territories. Inside the United States and its territories, it's still open source, but if the patent gets granted, that patent protection would supersede the existing open source license that the technology is published under. So, that being the case, um, I'm trying to kind of keep both doors open and see who walks in through either one of them. Uh, my primary interest is having this technology utilized. And so if China, for example, in desperation and desire to have a functioning economy, which they decreasingly have, were to steal this idea and implement it themselves, that actually probably wouldn't work out all that badly for me personally. Um, that kind of leverage would have a lot of other positive effects as well. So that's sort of an option. Um, Patents, laws can't constrain governments, right? So that you have an issue with that kind of public corruption. You also have an issue with the existence of national sovereignty. If there actually are like 160 to 190, and there's a lot of disagreement about what that number is supposed to be, countries in the world, and they're actual countries, then they get to decide how they're going to be countries. And so if the greater prosperity sphere of this particular plot of land can manage to claim to be a country and decides that intellectual property shouldn't exist there, then it doesn't. And if you can use an idea in that space, then not really anything you can do about it. That this is intellectual property is of increasing importance because we've discovered that there is a physical connection between the space of ideas and the universe that we occupy. That's actually what computers demonstrate, is how to physicalize imagination. Um, and property rights aren't necessarily the best fit, but humanity hasn't come up with a better idea than property uh, as a tool of social and political management of assets. And I don't have a better one of those up my sleeve. So I think this is sort of an ongoing philosophical exploration that we need to have through conversation and essay. I think that we're not focusing on it nearly enough as a species. And I'm trying to do the best that I can with the tools that I see in front of me to get us as a species to have economies that function, and I'll kind of see what happens. Um, but in terms of corruption, they violated their own procedures in order to make a claim that, 10 million and one are the same number effectively, uh, which is totally unsupportable. Uh, that it is hard to come up with a reason for that isn't corrupt.
Definitely. So just finally, Noah, like, I'm hoping that justice is served and the patent, all the paperwork comes through. Moving this forward, then getting users, getting everybody involved. How does all the ducks line up that everything works well for you? What do you need then for it to be working perfectly?
To operate, I need an operator, and operators need a pretty decent amount of public trust, which mostly you buy through regulatory compliance. So either a very large grassroots movement of potential consumers that would like a CDM to exist, or a much smaller group of fairly deep pocketed companies or individuals that would like to license CDM and cause it to exist, are the two paths that I need. Um, and so that's the patent is about sort of that second stage is having something to license to them. And then the first stage is more like things like this, getting the word out and trying to plant the seeds for a viral revolution.
Wish you super success. You might let the listeners know where they can find you.
Well, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. Happy to have you there. There's a website, Coordisc.com, where you can download the white paper that he's talking about, and there'll probably be a link in the description as well. You can also reach out to me directly if you just send me an email at Noah P. Healy, NOAHPHEALY at yahoo.com. The spam filter is pretty weak over there, so I will see it and I will get back to you.
Perfect. I'll make sure I put the links, both the audio and the video. That's all for the Speaking, Awakening, and Crypto Podcast. And you'll find all the episodes on the awakeningpodcast.org, the cryptopodcast.org, and the speakingpodcast.com. Be sure to give us a thumbs up, 5-star rating, share with your friends, and comment on what we discussed. I love to read your comments. Until next week, take care.